We had a class of 38 girls. Nobody in my class had a grandfather but me. And they came to see who saw a grandfather. I mean, in my mother's family alone, between her uncles and aunts and her cousins, 127 people never came back. Wow. 127 people.
For the younger generation that watches this, what do you hope they take away?
That they should remember the horror that happened to their family. And I hope that they'll turn out to be the kind of human beings who will never let anybody inflict anything like that on any human being. To do this to human beings without rhyme or reason is totally inexcusable.
Hello, please join me today for a conversation with Gitta Katz, who grew up in the Williamsburg Hasidic community, married in its tradition, and built a beautiful family with many wonderful children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Gitta was raised by Holocaust survivors who would often speak to the children about what they had been through. Gitta is a larger-than-life figure involved in all sorts of community charities and organizations, living life full of humor and convictions. The other day, I was lucky enough to spend several hours at her home and learn about her story of resilience, faith, and love, which is so important to preserve and share.
How old was your mother during the war?
My mother was 18 when the war started. No, she was younger. Because she got married in 1947 and she was 20. That means she was 18 when the war ended. She was probably 16 in 1942 when Czechoslovakia was taken to Auschwitz. So my mother was, they went on a march. My mother says she has no idea. It took them weeks till they got to, she doesn't remember where they were. But they were on foot, and then they went into a cattle car. And they were there for about 3 days in the cattle car, and then they arrived to Auschwitz.
Who's the they?
My grandmother and her 6 little children. My mother was born 7 years after my grandparents were married. She was an only child for 7 years. And when she was 7 years old, my grandmother in 11 years had 6 little children. So my mother was a teenager, but there was a bunch of little kids. Now my grandfather, all the men were taken away much before the whole city was taken out, on that death march. It wasn't really a death march, but it was a march somewhere. So my grandmother and all the women in the city were left with their children, and they took them away. So my grandmother had 6 little children, and the youngest was 2 years old. And between my grandmother and my mother, they took chances of carrying her. And when they got to this, it was called an Umschlagplatz, where they separated then. Of course, you probably know the story of the war, that the young people were, sent to the right.
And the people that could work.
That could work, yes, so would stay alive. My mother had no idea what that was all about. She says, and she was, when it was up to them, because they were all lined up, and by the time they got to my grandmother, she says, maybe 10 seconds before it was my grandmother's turn to be selected, she was holding her little sister, and it was very hard for her, it was very heavy, and she told her mother, Ma, she says, let's change. Take Surla, my little sister, and give me Shlomo, my little brother. I'll hold on to his hand, And at that moment, they separated my grandmother, and she was sent away with the 6 children. And, they walked down like a ramp. It was like a ramp that was, was downward sloped. And she says, I saw my mother disappearing slowly, and I ran after her. She says, and one of the Nazis ran after her and pulled her back. And as soon as, he let my mother very, very thick hair, and a very, very beautiful hair, and he dragged her by her hair. And so let go of her, she ran after them again. She said, by then, she says she hardly saw them. And she says she fell. And another German also ran after her and dragged her back. So the second German says, lass sie, leave her. And the first German says, sie ist zu schön zu vernichten, she's too beautiful to destroy. And he dragged her back. Wow. The only one who survived. Wow. Dragged back twice. Wow. Why would a German drag back? Hundreds of other Jewish girls were there like her. She was no sensation. And they dragged her back and they put her to the right. She says by the time, she was pulled back the second time, everybody was gone. She has no idea what happened to them. She has no idea where they were taken. She has no idea when they were, they were gassed for sure. What were they doing with a woman with 6 little children? And my mother went to the right, and she was taken she was taken on another trip with a cattle car.
She didn't know at all what was happening.
She had no idea. She had no clue. She doesn't even know whether, I mean, eventually they found out that all the people that were taken to the left were eventually killed, but she had no idea if they were killed the same day or they were first taken to some sort of a camp or they were taken to those bunkers, you know, she had no idea. And nobody ever stayed alive from that group to tell them what happened. My mother has no idea. So my mother, you know, lights a yahrzeit candle for my grandmother. She lights it on the day that they stood on that lineup, you know, and they were selected. Because that's the last day that she knew that she was, the last time she saw her alive. And nobody came back to tell the story. So what happened was that, yes, and then they were taken to a labor camp. And in the labor camp, there was not too many girls. She says usually there were many, many more girls in those camps, but over there was this labor camp had girls from all over Europe. And there were 3 girls there, 3 sisters, older girls, who were there together with my mother, and they knew of my mother's family. Those sisters' aunt was married to my grandfather's brother. So their name, my mother's name, was familiar to them. My mother's maiden name was Krakauer, although they were never in Poland, but her maiden name was Krakauer. And these 3 girls had an aunt who was also married to a Krakauer. And they found out there in the camp that those 2 Krakauers were brothers. So they knew of the Krakauer girl. You know, they knew of my mother's family's existence. And they were very protective of her. My mother was a Pechech. You know, she was an only child after 7 years. And she says that she couldn't bear what was going on there.
Like what?
She says she couldn't bear the hunger, like most people. But she said, you know, I didn't want to live. She says some of the girls, she says, they fought for their lives. She says day and night they would starve and try to, she says when they used to have the lineups every day, every morning, she says some of the girls just dropped on the floor. They would bring them out 5 o'clock in the morning, line them up, hundreds of girls in the freezing weather. And my mother said we had a cotton dress, you know, the striped uniforms. And first they let them stand for a couple of hours because they were counted. If God forbid there was one girl missing, they checked in the barracks if they hadn't died there. You know, they made sure that they were there, you know, they were died. And if they were unaccounted for, she says, then they just randomly chose 10 girls instead and shot them. Afterwards, it came to a point where my mother told these girls, you know, I don't want to live anymore. I can't do this. I have no energy. I'm not interested. There's nobody who I'm going back to. Probably by the time this war's over, there'll be nobody alive. And those 3 girls told my mother, she says, you know, try to stay alive. The war is probably going to end soon. She says, and I want you to know we have a very nice brother and you're going to marry him. You know, just have perseverance. And my mother said to me, she says, and those stupid girls, that's the way she questions. She says, they're not and they think their brother is alive. He's not alive. I mean, probably every man and boy, older boy was killed. Their brother's not alive. But they nudged her and egged her on and they gave her part of their food and they saved her bread because my mother worked at a shift from 5 in the morning till 10 at night. And they went to work from 10 at night overnight. So they hardly met. They were in the same barracks. But you know, every time when she arrived before they were leaving to work, my mother came home, they always gave her an extra piece of bread because they so badly wanted her to live. It was amazing. And my mother was working there in a weaving factory for 12 hours every day. So they would get out in the morning at 5 o'clock. They made them stand in line for hours. And they would all have to take a cold shower. And my mother says, we didn't have a towel. So it's freezing cold outside, and this was winter. In the summer it was warm, it was a different story. But my mother says that we stood out there in the cold, and we didn't have a towel to dry up. She says we put on the wet clothing on our wet body. The icicles froze on our dresses from the wet. No shoes. She says the ones who, because, you know, the ones who were taken to the gas chambers, you know, they completely took all their clothing away. The ones who they kept alive, they gave them wooden clogs. She says we stood there, wooden clogs, she says. Our toes were frozen, our fingers were frozen, and our dress was dripping ice cold water. Then we started marching to the factory where we went to work. It was about a mile's march, she says, which took about 20 minutes or a half hour, she says. And sometimes, you know, you couldn't walk fast enough. Your clogs got stuck. She says, if you stopped and bent down to pick it up and put it on, they shot you. So very often you ended up walking with just one clog, barefoot.
Wow.
And she says, and nobody dared to stop. And if you just bent down to pick up your shoes, you just never got up.
Wow.
And she said you couldn't even turn around to see what happened. Maybe they're half alive. Maybe they were just wounded in their legs. Let's try to hold them up and drag them. She says you weren't allowed to move. You couldn't breathe. And she said she went to this weaving factory every day and she wove. And she explained to us how the weaving went, which was very complicated. But somehow she described me that you had something that looked like a little tiny boat and a bunch of thread was rolled on. You had to constantly aim it onto a hook. She says if you missed the hook, the machine got stuck. And there was always a woman who she was like a supervisor. She was called the Lagerselste. She was, the manager, the supervisor. And if that got stuck, she says, if she was in a good mood, she helped you repair it and put the machine back on, the weaving machine. If not, they just shot you. Now, my mother was very pretty, and when Hashem wants, you find Chen even in a German's eyes. She liked my mother. And my mother told her once, she says, when I'll finish weaving, I'll weave an extra piece of fabric, and if you'll bring me a needle and thread, I'll sew you up a skirt so you'll be warm.
Who said it?
My mother said it to this Lagerselste.
Why wasn't this woman warm?
Well, she stood there in the freezing cold. She was warmer than my mother was, than all the other girls. But my mother wanted to say something nice to her and be a little positive about what's going on, She tried to sort of get her attention maybe. And on account of that, every time when the machine got stuck, my mother said when she didn't aim right, she rather whispered, she made my mother just keep quiet. She'll just walk off or fix it, because she had a German SS supervising her, making sure that she doesn't let them get away with murder. You understand?
Murder. Yeah.
Murder. And if it ever got stuck, she once in a while her aim wasn't so perfect. She would just come and repair it for her, set it up and start the machinery again. And for that, my mother always gave her fabric. And my mother, she would bring it back, and my mother would take it back to her bunker. My mother would sew it up. You had to make two seams, just a raw piece of material. And for that, my mother always got half a loaf of bread. And she says, and that she was able to keep herself a little bit more sustained. And she also shared it with, every time she shared it with the girls around her. And this went on until almost the end of the war. And my mother couldn't bear it anymore. And then 2 days later, she said, I'm just not going to listen to those girls anymore. I can't bear this anymore. I'm not going to take the bread from this Lagerselste, and I will just starve to death. She said, by the time I get back from a march after being there for 10 hours in the factory, she says, I'm just going to collapse anyway and die. She was planning this. She was waiting to get weak enough where she would just collapse, because you can't feign it, If you feign it, then they shoot you. And my mother says, and what if they don't shoot me to death and I'll be laying there half dead, If you committed a crime, which was a crime, in their eyes, then they made sure you were dead. But sometimes they just aimed at you, she says, and then, you didn't die, and then you were just left there. She says, an awful situation. And 2 days later, she says the war was over. And they opened up the gates. And she says, we all started walking. She says, I have no idea where I was at the end of the war. She doesn't know if she was in Germany or Poland, because they were traveling. They were taking us to different lagers and to different work camps. And she says one time, she had absolutely no idea where she was. But she definitely was in a place where it said, Arbeit macht frei. You know that very famous, yes, in Auschwitz. So she says, and she got out of that gate, she says, and she had no idea, what do I do now? And then she met a Jewish man, and he asked her where she was going, an older man who survived the war, a Jewish man. And he says, where are you from? She says, I'm from Galanta. And he said, you can't go back there. There's nobody there. Nobody survived. You have no business going back there. Nobody survived Galanta. So she says, so what am I doing now? So he told her that there's a house there that somebody set up, because as soon as the war was over, the survivors, the older people, the first thing they did was make sure to get housing for the girls, because, the Russians were rampant. and they were raping the girls left and right. So he took her into a house. It was a fairly decent house. It was an empty house. There were a bunch of beds there and a bunch of girls there. She says, I was in a town in Czechoslovakia. She says, we had food there. There were two older girls who were there and they cooked for us. And then one day, one of the girls who were also living in that house came upstairs and she tells my mother, she says, there's a soldier standing downstairs and he asked me if there's a girl there by the name of Bashi Krakauer. That was my mother's name. My mother's name was Batsheva. And I said yes. So this man tells me, please go upstairs and tell her she should come to the window. And my mother goes to the window. She sees a man there who she doesn't know from Adam. Very, very skinny, short man. And he looks at her, he smiled at her, and she thought, this maniac, who's this man who's looking for me? She had no idea who he was. And my mother came away from the window. She didn't even discuss it with anybody. And 2 days later, another girl who was coming upstairs from the street tells my mother, a different girl. She says, there's a man over there downstairs, and he asked me to tell Bashi Krakauer to come out to the porch. There was apparently a porch, there were a fire escape. My mother goes out and she sees the same man again, and she's thinking, what on earth does he want from me? Now, my mother, when she was born, you have to understand, she was born after 7 years, and she was very spoiled. And everybody called her Bashi. My grandfather called her Bashela, but nobody else, not my grandmother, not her siblings. And she's looking at that crazy man, and he tells her, Bashela, du kennst mich nicht. My mother's thinking, nobody besides my father knows my name, Bashela. Nobody called me Bashela. This was my private secret, my endearing name between me and my father. This must be my father. And she tells him, Bis mein Tata. So he said, yeah. And she went downstairs and she asked him, he says, when you were here a few days ago, why didn't you tell me right away? Why didn't you say Bashela? He says, I didn't want to scare you. I figured, you'll be so shocked. I figured if you don't recognize me, and I'm going to tell you I'm your father, he says, I knew it would be a very, very big shock. I thought you'll go in and maybe you'll have some recognition of something that you might think it was your father or a relative. He says, but I saw that you had no recognition, no thought of this might be somebody that I know, it says, and I wasn't going to scare you.
Wow.
And he took her. She left with him. They went back to their city, to Galanta. Of course, the apartment was occupied by Goyim. They just moved in, neighbors who they knew.
Yeah.
It was my grandfather's house. And he said, I lived here until 1942. This is my house. And they slammed the door in their face. My mother says she doesn't remember how it came about, but they did get an apartment. She says that, there were people, Askunim, who were in all the cities that they came back to, their own cities. And, the older mature men or older boys, they helped the people get themselves a little bit settled and established. Mama says she doesn't remember, but my grandfather did get an apartment. And they settled there. They bought some stuff, they got beds somehow, and they lived there. And nobody came back, she says. Nobody survived. It was my grandfather and my mother and nobody. People, not adults, people. 25 people. That included maybe a child who was saved by some sheer miracle who was seen throughout the war. He says there was nobody. It was a haunted town. After a few months, one afternoon, a man arrives, and with them, one of the 3 girls that were with her in the labor camp. And they came with that, that adult male was my father. My father stayed there, for about a week and a half, and they became engaged. Bashi Weber Nie Krakauer has over 400 descendants.
Really?
Yeah, my mother left over 400 descendants. My mother had, by the time she passed away, she had 41 great-grandchildren. 5 great.
Wow.
5 generations.
How did she feel about that in relation to the Holocaust? I'm asking because very often people say the Hasidim have a lot of children to replace the
My mother never said that. I know people make a comment, not on the Kuma for Hitler, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
My mother never said that. That never came out of her mouth for some reason.
When did she pass away, by the way?
Not even a year ago. September will be a year.
Wow, how
that
old
she
was
passed
she?
away. How old? She was 4 months short of her 98th birthday.
Wow.
Okay?
What was it like to have a grandfather as a child?
The most unbelievable feeling of deliciousness and love.
Yeah.
So when my grandfather came to America, I remember there was a big sensation.
When did he come to America?
He came to America in 1960.
Why?
Because at that time, you see, the first reason that he stayed behind was because he says, what is an old man of not even 50 years old going to do, be there? But then the second thing he says, he doesn't think that it's fair for him to do it because there were few Yidden who survived in Czechoslovakia. He was a shoichet. He was about tefillah. He was a moil. He says, now I'm going to leave this few Yidden hefker. Who's going to come over here shecht for 8 or 10 Yidden, you know, when there was nobody left? It's not like there was a shoichet in the next town. He says, I didn't think it was fair of me. He says, I must have stayed alive. My grandfather also stayed alive by some miraculous reason. They left him for dead and, you know, he wasn't dead, you know. So he says, not for nothing did Hashem let me stay alive. He says, you know, it's meant for me to, you know, take care of them, yes. But then by the time, you know, 10 years later, he, you know, probably, you know, there were more Yidden. And I guess he felt that, you know, the people were going to be, you know, be doing okay without him. And my mother was his only child. And he very, very desperately wanted to be with my mother and his grandchildren. So at that time he was already 10 years older. He was already 60 years old. And he came to America. And I remember one day going to school and telling my friend, I'm not coming to school tomorrow. And my grandfather's arriving to America. And I didn't go to school. And I don't have to get into the old excitement and everything. And then Shabbos morning, we went out in the gate. So we're standing there, my mother and me and my siblings were waiting for my Zayda to come. And as I get out of our house, I see my whole class is standing on the corner. My mother lived one house away from the corner. So they were right there. I says, girls, what happened? I really thought maybe one of the girls in my class died. They came to tell me. I really expected them to tell me something horrible. We came to see a Zayda.
Wow.
We had a class of 38 girls. Then there wasn't parallel classes. Nobody in my class had a grandfather but me. And they came to see who saw a grandfather. And my grandfather, you know, he moved very close to us, not too far away. So my father, you know, was asking around for the people if they know anybody, you know, and a woman also who lost her first husband was survived. And he heard about this woman in a different city. He went with my mother and they met her, you know, and they spent some time with her. They came back and told my father, you know, we met her. She doesn't have children. And I think you should go, you know, go to meet her. And he went and he met her. And a few weeks later, I don't know, for weeks or months, but they got married. She came to live with my grandfather. But she was a very, very nice, fine woman, but she was a step-grandmother. She never had children. And, you know, her reaction to us was not like a biological grandmother. She was a little bit different, but she was very nice. And she was wonderful to my grandfather. The marriage was a very nice marriage, you know. And so my grandfather, we went every Friday night from when the men came in from Shield. My father stopped into our house and you picked up my mother and all of us and we went. And then already his grandchildren went, you know, and it became like a whole family thing. And it was a highlight of our week. Wow. And during the week, he went every day. He went across the bridge on the east side. There was a kollel over there for elder men. And my grandfather went to learn there. And the bus stop crossing the bridge was across the street from where we lived. And my grandfather would first stop in every day, come to see my mother. Sometimes my mother didn't wake up early enough because like she was sewing all night, you know. Then he would go upstairs and check if she's sleeping and he would cover her up, see if she's not sweating because, you know, in Europe, bei Schwitzen verkühlt man sich, then you have to change your nightgown.
If you're sweating,
then you're going to catch a cold, then you're going to get sick, you know. That because my mother always used to wake us up middle of the night, you know, if we were sweating, you know, if we had temperature, she would wake up middle of the night to check us if we were sweating. She would change us from head to toe, our undershirt and our underwear and our pajamas because you're going to get sick if you're sweating. You know,
wow.
So my grandfather checked, you know, no, she's not schwitzing, she doesn't have to change her nightgown. He would come down, shh, Kinder, hätte ich euch, Mama schläft noch. Wow. And my mother said, the best thing was, it's noch zugedeckt, der kleine Meidl, you know? That was the joy of his life.
Wow.
I mean, you could imagine.
He had a lot of nachas in the end.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes.
Anyone who survived, it was pure luck.
Absolutely pure luck. And I'm telling you, my mother, this SS says, zu schön zu vernichten. When did ever a Nazi say this on a Jewish girl? She's too beautiful to destroy.
How did your mother make sense of it? Did she
didn't.
talk about it?
She talked about it all the time.
How so?
What? How so?
How did she talk about the Holocaust?
She told us her whole experience from beginning to end and everything that she remembers from what happened around her. But she never...
How old were you when she talked about
Oh,
it?
we were very young. We were 9, 10, 11 years old. How did it all start? Because there was a man who survived the war, and he started publishing like a little pamphlet. Every week it came out, his experience from the war. A fascinating story, a continuation for weeks and weeks and weeks. And it was distributed for free, all over Williamsburg and Borough Park, I don't remember.
In Yiddish? It was in Yiddish.
No, in Hungarian.
In Hungarian.
And my father brought it home every Friday. My mother read it, and as she was reading, she was translating his story to us. It was a fascinating story. I don't remember the story, but I remember the man very well. And then somehow we asked my mother at the very beginning when this, was happening. She says, "Man, where were you during the war?" She says, "I was there." She says, "Man, what happened to you?" She says, "And I'll tell you." And that's how it started. And I remember we had a Castro couch in the dining room. We opened it. My mother sat in the middle. We all surrounded her. I mean, the 5 or 6 big ones, not the little one. And she told us her whole story. And, and every time we sat together, there was always another little detail that she forgot and she told us about it, My father only talked about Pesach by the Seder, but he also told us very explicitly how he was. My father stayed alive because they found him once and he didn't go to work. He says he couldn't get out of his bunker. He says they came in, they beat him to a pulp. They threw him down on the floor into his bunk. He says, and he played dead. He says, and they left him for dead. He says, and very slowly he crawled out of the bunker. He says, and it was not too far from a forest. It was also a very cloudy day, so it was dark. He says, and he crawled in a forest, and it was the last 3 months of the war. And he says he found a very large piece of candle. And he says he chewed that all day. And he says, and at night he rolled it into a ball, let it harden overnight, and he chewed that, the next day. He said, did that for 3 months.
How does that help?
Because he says at last he had saliva. He says if he wasn't eating or chewing, he said there was no saliva. He says, and he says, and for dessert he ate the leaves from the forest. And that's how he lived for 3 months, and that's how he survived the war.
When they talked about it, did they cry? Were they
No.
sentimental?
Not my parents.
It was more like this is the dramatic tale?
I'm thinking in hindsight, why they didn't cry then I don't understand. I think because they didn't let them, so I think they wanted to they just told us the story, but they didn't want to become very, very into it. They didn't want to become very intuitive of what it did to them. But in hindsight, I think that they didn't want to cry because they didn't want to make us feel sad.
But when they told the stories, it wasn't in a...
No, it wasn't a low key, it wasn't like they was telling us some very nice novel, They told us a story, but very dramatically. I mean, my mother described how every morning at 5 o'clock she came out, took a freezing cold shower, and she says, and then we put on that thin cotton dress, she says, and it stuck to us, she said, because it became icicles, she says, and then very, very slowly it started melting, but then it still froze, she says. It took hours till that dress dried, she says. And then she says, you're freezing cold, she says, and she says, your head is shaven bald. She says, and we didn't have a hat on our head, nothing. She says, and you're walking with clogs that you also have to focus on not letting it fall off your feet in the winter when there was fresh snow. And she says that, you only had to concentrate on how am I going to survive the day? They didn't think, is this going to end? Why did this happen? How is this going to end? Where's everybody? She says they were so concerned just staying alive on a daily basis. She says that. My mother told me that, she used to get bread from that, that Lager Elster who she sewed that skirt for. And she says that my mother came home at night and the people around her, they went to work at night. So she had to be very careful because otherwise everything was stolen. She says, they stole your shoes. She says, my mother says she had her clogs. She says, I slept on my clogs every night, she said. Because if I didn't sleep, they wouldn't be there in the morning. You couldn't leave it under your bed. She says, and my bread, she says, I slept on my clock, she says, and I had that half a loaf of bread. She says, and I was hugging it, she says, under my chin, she said, that they shouldn't take it, she says. And you couldn't blame anybody, she said, because everybody was starved, Yeah. It wasn't an act of rambunctiousness. people were starved to death. My mother said, but I was also starved, you know?
Yeah.
So she says, you fended for yourself, but she says, anything that anybody did that was out of knowledge, she says, was very normal.
Wow.
It was very normal.
How did she talk about the Holocaust in terms of her faith or Yiddishkeit or God?
Never had a problem. She says, this is something which probably was destined to be. He says, we don't understand it. She says, I'm not going to ask questions. She says, because I'll never understand it anyway. How do you understand that? I was still up, 6 million children. I mean,
Yeah.
I went to the Holocaust Museum to Washington, D.C. They had like a window. It was probably as big as, this area here till the end of my kitchen. It was filled with thousands of tiny children's shoes. And I just stood there and I cried buckets. I said, for all I know, my mother's little sister's shoes in there, And I thought, this is Hashem Tzigalast. But I said, if I'll think, I'll become an apikoyes because it doesn't make sense. But listen, but if I believe that there is Hashem and I believe that feed the Welt, then probably I don't understand that. I never tried. And I think my parents had the same attitude because I never heard them say why.
Never.
No.
How do you think though they carried? I guess my question is, how did they carry God on? Yiddishkeit from the Holocaust?
Only because they believed. Only because they believed that there's a higher power that brought this on us. And just like he brought us, the war came to an end, and in the most unbelievable circumstances and situation, some people stayed alive, and some people who were a hairbreadth away from staying alive, they didn't make it out the last minute. My uncle Poparoof had 11 children before the war, and he lost 10 of them, and he didn't lift his seed, but people said that his oldest son was alive after he survived the war, but he died from dysentery. When some of these people, Now, what does a person think? Ich habe verloren in 10 einzige geblieben, in noch ein Krieg ist gestorben.
Horrifying.
And also, just like the Klosenberg Rebbe, he moved on, he got remarried, he remarried my father's sister, he had a new family. And my father said that his children from his first marriage were so gelungen.
Wow.
He says they were the top notch, he says gorgeous. He had a beautiful wife. They were gorgeous, they were smart, they were cute.
God.
Chasanagat, a year after the war. My cousin told my first cousin, his oldest daughter, Chanala, she says he never ever spoke about them. She says one day she went into his Sfurim Stieb and she saw, Yurzat left burning. She says, the famous Yurzat, is a name since then. So that's when he says, mit Kinder vor der Krieg. But she says he was the most normal father. My uncle was a very, very wonderful husband and father. How do I know? Because every time my mother had a baby, we stayed there, when my mother was in the hospital. So, I saw it, At home, he was not a Rebbe at home. He was a father. He diapered babies. He knit challis for my aunt, So I believe him, I know that this is true. He's never, ever did he talk a word about it. So you see, you can understand it. I don't. Frida, it's almost 8 years since my husband passed away. I knew he was dying. He survived 2 other illnesses, and I knew that it was a miracle. So what else could I expect? How lucky can you get? I haven't gotten over it. Absolutely not. Every single day, I still ask Hashem, why couldn't you let him live a cup? I still say, why did it bother you? Do I say Gleibish and Eibishter? No, I don't say that. But I don't understand why he couldn't be he should live another few years,
Yeah.
But if I would want, I could become a koifer. I could say, what are you doing to me?
Yeah. And how do you not?
I don't know. Listen, because I think that I came to the point where I not only I recognized, but I was able to completely internalize that Siddha B'Shefer of the Welt. Listen, and I want to tell you something. We all have questions. I had a lot of questions in my life, I didn't understand. If you don't understand something, you don't believe something, But I knew, and I hope that at a certain time in my life, or at a certain age, I'll understand it better. That's all. And I'm telling you now, as life goes on, You know, I just see that every little thing, nothing is self-made.
For the younger generation that watches this, what do you hope they take away? And then
What I hope they take away is what probably most, I mean, I see it even in by my own family, that they should remember the horror that happened to their family, to their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, and the world doesn't acknowledge it. You know, that humanity was dealt such a terrible, terrible, miserable blow, and life goes on. And I want them to remember that their offsprings are very, very special people who they never had an opportunity to meet and to know. And I hope that they'll turn out to be the kind of human beings who will never, never let anybody inflict anything like that on any human being, regardless of race or creed or background, because to do this to human beings without rhyme or reason is totally, totally inexcusable. That's what I want them to remember.
I want to know what your childhood was like in Williamsburg.
So my childhood in Williamsburg was, in general, my childhood was like everybody's life in Williamsburg. But in our house, it was a very, very wonderful atmosphere. I grew up with a large family, many siblings. I have 6 brothers and 4 sisters. My mother was an unbelievably loving mother. You know, she nurtured us. You know, there were so many things that we didn't have, which other children had. I didn't have beautiful toys. We didn't go to trips, and we didn't go traveling anywhere. We didn't have a car, and you know, a lot of luxuries that children were starting to get in my generation, which we didn't have. But the atmosphere in the house was so wonderful, you know, that it was delicious to be at home with my parents. You know, my father was very strict. But that was the only way that he could control 6 boys and 4 girls. I mean, it was a rambunctious bunch. Everybody, all my siblings probably have a fabulous sense of humor. And there was just never a quiet moment in the house. Everybody was always saying something that was sarcastic or funny. And it was just a very happy home.
How did you entertain yourselves?
I read a tremendous amount.
What did you read?
Well, a lot of Yiddish, you know. Actually, I read everything that I could lay my hands on, you know?
Cereal boxes.
Exactly. See, you know that, you know. But I was a bookworm, and there was a store around the corner from where I lived, a secondhand bookstore. And I had a friend, a woman my mother's age, and she introduced me to that store. And there I would get books for 25 cents, you know, used books. And my mother always, you know, she censored them. And I read, that's what I read when I had nothing to read. My father was totally against me reading books. Yes. And I totally...
Goyish books, that's
Goyish books, yeah. I did it totally behind his back, but my mother knew about it. And I knew that as long as it was, and my mother knew that if it wasn't okay, she wouldn't either, you know, approve of it. So I didn't feel guilty. I just didn't want to get caught. And I remember that I begged my father that I want to get a reading lamp. And my father couldn't understand why I need a reading lamp. You go to bed, you go to sleep. He didn't know that I had something under my cover and I was up all night doing it, you know.
What were you reading?
Classics. Do I remember? I read Charles Dickens. I read Tess of the Dubervilles. I read Catherine Cookson. I'm not into novels. I'm not into romance, you know. I like to read something that has a plot and something that I'm looking forward to see the end, you know. And that's how I was as a child also. Everything that I did was as regular as everybody else that you would know or you would have known or I would have known. The only difference was that I, as a child, was a very mature, responsible kid. And I felt very bad for my mother, that she has so many children and she's working so hard, and my father was working very hard. My father was a very mature, responsible man. Like I said, you know, he worked 2 jobs. He went to work after his teaching. He went to another job, and I'm telling you, never owed a red cent in his life. And I felt very bad that, you know, why are they working so hard? And I felt an inner obligation, an innate obligation that I must help them, you know. I'm healthy, I have everything. I have clothing, I have a nice warm home, I have enough food. And I really, as a child, I was involved in their household lifestyle much more than was regular. So the responsibilities that I took upon myself was self-made. But I was very, very, very much involved in the household, goings on, and I helped a tremendous amount, much more than most girls my age did. And I was a hardworking kid, and my mother, interestingly enough, many years later, she told me, she says, "Was bin gewesen als narisch? Für was hab ich denn gelost als schwer arbeiten?" I says, "Ma, now you're telling me." but I want to tell you something, but it's not like she made me do anything. I just did.
You were a serious
Yes,
kid.
I was a serious kid. But you should know, but on the other hand, I was not, I had a very good sense of humor. I was fun-loving. I wasn't the kind of kid who was bogged down in these things, I had fun with my friends. But I was very concerned and very sympathetic always at why my parents have such a hard life.
You were carrying the burden of your father struggling.
And independently, it was not put upon me.
It was self-imposed. It's a kind of kid.
It's definitely a kind of kid.
You see it. I see it in my own family. Some siblings took on so much the serious, like they absorbed the sense of responsibility and carried a load no one gave them.
And how did your parents react to it? I mean, they let it be, or they?
Yeah, of course, my mother took all the help that she could. I wasn't the one who was doing it.
Okay, because you were among the younger ones, probably.
I'm the fifth. My older sister especially was very serious about worrying. This is not done. The kitchen is not cleaned at night. Everything was her problem.
I took it. We never had a cleaning woman. All the years that I lived at home, never did they have a cleaning woman. And we lived in a 5-bedroom and an 8-room apartment. It was a big house. We had a backyard and a front yard and a gate and a hallway and steps and tenants. And the house was spotless.
Wow.
And I did everything. I wasn't the kind of kid who wanted a doll, because I never had time to play because I made myself so busy. I remember my memories of my brothers. My brothers are all tall. They were big people. 5 of my 6 brothers are 6 feet and over, And my memories of them, all of them laying on the floor and reading. Whether, school books or English books or Sforum, and they were constantly borrowing books from the neighbors and friends, It was more into that. I don't know which came first, the chicken or the egg, but maybe because we didn't have the games, the toys, then they ended up doing this, And I'm telling you, my father was a tremendous reader. My mother was a tremendous reader. My mother read Hungarian.
But your father was very careful about what he allowed you to
No, my father read Sforum. My father read Russian Kodesh, not English. No, but I have to tell you, my father, in the bathroom, he would read the New York Times.
Really?
And my father, his accent was bad. But my father, there were times when in high school, I asked my father the definition of words, because he read and he
absorbed
everything.
What was his attitude towards America?
He had no problem with it. I mean, he had no problem with it. We lived in Monkeden. We grew up in Monkeden. Met gedavend met Jiden, met gasten gehad met Jiden. My mother was rather more surprised when she would, I can't think of an example that goes back as far as when we were children, but I remember her shock when Dinkins became the mayor of New York. She says, where no, that's not a good example, because I remember there was a situation where there was somebody who was not Jewish, and my mother was shocked how nice he was to Jewish people. My mother says that in Europe, she says, nobody was nice to Jewish people. She says, even though we didn't live in Poland, even though the anti-Semitism in Poland was so horrible, she says, everybody knew that nobody liked the Jews in the whole world. She says, to think that a Gentile treats a Jew nice without any animosity, it didn't exist there. My mother was very shocked, and she, she thought this is a Medina Shel Malchus. You come here, you're free. You're not afraid to walk out when you're recognizable as a Jewish man or woman, You didn't have to hide your kippah, your couple. That was fascinating to her.
Interesting.
It was never an issue by us. I remember my mother once had to have emergency surgery, a kidney repair. And the doctor, we had a recommendation of a very good doctor in New York Cornell. And my mother asked me, is Ayid? I says, 9. So she says, I'm not going to let him do it. She says, I says, Ma, why? He's one of the top, nephrologists. So she says, I said, Mommy, come on. And of course, he was her surgeon, you understand? But she was...
Wait, he ended up doing the surgery.
Of course.
Did she change her tune?
No, it was just for the spur of the moment thing. She didn't harbor it and she didn't talk about it. I told her, Mommy was recommended by the MRA, with the Medical Record Association of Williamsburg. I says, you don't trust them? I says, then find the doctor, I says. But he's the most, the highest recommendation for nephrologists at this time is Dr. McCarran in Cornell.
Uh-huh.
But she says in the Heim, they have a getrost on this, I go, you understand? But otherwise it was absolutely not an issue. It was not brought up.
Was there an attitude towards modernity? And I guess I'm not hearing a Fremdkeit in your, really a big...
Well, let me tell you something. We were very, very Hasidish. From the day I became 3-year-old, I could never wear knee socks. Now, at that time, the style was very, very short. So if I'll show a picture of myself as a child, my dress is up to here. Uh-huh. But I was wearing long socks and then my elbows had to be covered. Uh-huh. My mother wore covered sheitel all her life. I never wore only bulletproof stockings, until I got married. My brothers didn't wear bibit because my father didn't either. He put it on later in his life. But at that time, we were the most Hasidic family, among the most very Hasidic families.
How your marriage to your husband happened, how your engagement to him?
My engagement happened like Pearl says, but not to such an extent. I met him a few times.
Where?
The first time I met him was by a cousin's house because, my father said, I can't bring my book and my husband, and then I'll say no. He said, I'm going to go to Hashemen. He'll feel comfortable in a relative's house, and we met there. And then my mother was not for the shidduch. My husband was very, very, very thin and ausgedacht. My mother kept on saying, I tell my father Yidel, she says, Nishka gesinte Bucher. I'm telling you, nicht gesinnt. But he came very, very, very highly recommended,
What was your impression of him?
Very interesting. Wow. I'll tell you what happened. We had a cousin from England who was here in Yeshiva in Satmar. And every once in a while he would come to us eat for Shabbos. And I had a bunch of brothers, rambunctious and loud and noisy and everything. And, I was fed up from them. I just wanted peace and quiet. And he used to come to us for Shabbos occasionally. And he was very idle and quiet, and withdrawn. And if ever I said anything to him, which I didn't do much, he would blush.
Oh.
So I thought to myself, I want such a man who blushes when a woman talks to him. I don't need those things. I want you to know that my husband, till the last of life, was such a quiet person, but he was such personality. And my brothers are so much fun still. It's nobody really changes,
I see.
But
So your impression when you met him was
then when I met, so first of all, before I met him, I told him, I said, Tati, what should I do? I says, Mami zug b'shema neufish, and this zug starts, he's such a nice book. So my father says, if you have the slightest doubt in your mind, the slightest, not 1%, but he says 1%, say no. So I felt very good, So it says I don't have to try to satisfy everybody. I have to think about what I think about him. And the first thing when I met him, when I sat and talked to him, I think, oh, he's blushing.
Ah, sweet.
And that's it. That's the first impression I came away with when I met him the first time, And then I met him a few times, and did I fall in love with him? Absolutely not. And I was very proud of myself because I knew that I can't hang out with him until I fall in love with him. And I know that I won't fall in love with him when you see a man 2 or 3 times and you sit a few hours and talk. I knew that. I didn't think it was real.
You were proud that you weren't smitten like a...
Yes. I thought to myself, that smitten is not real. You either know your person long enough and you know why you're smitten, but just because he blushes, that's not smitten, It was just something that caught my eye the minute it happened, And I said, look, I liked him. He was very soft-spoken, which I appreciate very much because I'm telling you, I just want to get away from those boys. And he was charming. He was charming. And
Did you have a hard time carrying a conversation?
no,
No.
absolutely. He was an intelligent man, you know?
Yeah.
Listen, he couldn't live with me for so many years if we didn't somehow match, you know? He was soft-spoken, he was good-natured, never carried grudges, never lost his temper. I'm telling you, he was really a very unusual man. And you know, the funny thing is that when I married him, I got used to him as being the way he is, you know? And I only realized afterwards, you know, that he was not the typical husband, you know? And that's why it's so hard for me to get over him.
Yeah.
Because you know what? It wasn't done in a how should I say it, in a smoochy-moochy way.
Yeah.
His whole behavior toward me was in a very nonchalant way. That nothing is as important as me being happy or being comfortable or being satisfied or being grateful or being calm. Everything that he did was to make me happy. To make me happy or feel good about anything, you know? But it wasn't something, you know, he never showed me off in public. He never did that in public. He never flaunted it, you know? But now in hindsight, when I think of the things he did when he was dying, and he was so sick, but he never forgot all those good middays that he had and the good ways that he treated me as somebody special to the last day of his life. And I think I told this to you, maybe I didn't. He passed away on a Wednesday. And it was 2 days before he passed away, and he was already in hospice. And I went.
He had cancer.
Yes, he had cancer. And the third time. And I went to hospice. I didn't sleep. You know, one of my sons slept overnight. Usually it was rather my grandsons. And on the way, I used to work, you know, in different places. I had 2 different jobs. So I you know, one of my jobs I quit, but the second job I didn't want to give up because, it was a good job and I needed to do something. So this was Monday and I was going to work. I slept home and I quickly took an Uber and I stopped over there in front of, the hospice. And I went up just to see how his night was. And I walk in there and if I tell you that death warmed over is an understatement. So, and I says, hi, how are you? How did you sleep? He says, "Can you get some frühstück?" I says, no. Then he goes, shh, don't talk to me. I said, look, I have no time to ask frühstück. He said, then I'm not telling you how the night was. I says, goodbye. And I went down to took the Uber. I came back at 12:30, I finished. And hi, I says, some hi. He says, was a yes? And I says, 9. So he took, you had over there some cookies or something he did with an Ensure. He says, I don't care if you drink Ensure, but I'm not going to talk to you until the Essen Shepherd's. This is a man who was not alive 2 days later. He refused to even let me speak because I didn't eat since the night before,
Wow.
That's what I remember. That was the last thing he did. See, at that time, there was nothing else. So Western Union, all the Canadians, my in-laws lived in Canada, sent me telegrams.
Wow, let me see.
Here. Grand Paradise, Mazel Tov, Stach. Avram Tzvi, Schembelg. I know, you see all these people here.
Oh, that is so funny.
Herzliche Mazel Tov für Kusen Kalle und von ich Eichel Rabbi and Rebbe Schwartz and family, whose daughter became my sister-in-law 4 years later.
Oh, really?
Yes. Wünschen herzliche Mazel Tov in viel Glück. Family Shir Friedman and son Cheskel.
Oh, that is hilarious. Why couldn't they spell it more?
No, but you spelled it over the phone. And when you spell it with somebody, and you don't hear, well, it wasn't phones like today,
I mean, even with
You're still filming us, I warn you. Okay, good, then go ahead. Okay, that's fine. Yes, now make sure that vase, a big vase, is centered right underneath this picture. No, not underneath my husband's picture. It's gotta be like Pearl's room. I will not.
The competition.
So quickly.